Okay. Well, so now we're getting our
Okay, thanks everyone for coming to the seminar. So we had a slot in the seminar series, and we thought it might be useful to talk about something that has been keeping a lot of people busy, both inside Ethiopia and elsewhere, and in fact is one of the saddest conflicts in the last 10 years. We have been hearing about Syria, we have been hearing about Yemen. Unfortunately, not a lot of people talk about Yemen, although there are millions and millions of people starving. We can't hear about Afghanistan. Of course, Afghanistan is a tragedy, but there are more people dying elsewhere. That's the unfortunate thing about the way the media works, is some places are not interesting enough. And on top of that, when you have media not being allowed, you have a very sad situation where you are dependent on the people who are actually causing the problems for information. And this last week, the biggest issue was the United Nations Security Council meeting again, and the UN Secretary General asking the Ethiopian government to provide proof why it was kicking out 7 senior officials of the United Nations. Basically, what we have is we have a new pattern in Africa, which we saw some 15 years ago in the Sudan, where there was a genocide happening, and it was the international community that was crying out, and still people are waiting for justice. And the pattern is you turn off electricity, you turn off power, you turn off all communication so that news doesn't come out. And that's what happened in Ethiopia. The new government in Ethiopia was practicing that for a couple of years with a people called Oromos. Oromos are the largest group in Ethiopia, and the new prime minister claims to be Oromo, but that's where they tried this thing. So you turn off mobile services, telecommunication, and then you go in and do whatever you like. There are a lot of other things happening. I don't want to get into the main topic, but I will let Jeff introduce himself. Jeff worked in Ethiopia. He has a lot of interest in Ethiopia and ties to Ethiopia. He was at ELCA. ELCA is one of the best known international research centers, part of the CGAR system. Now it's called ARE. It used to be called the International Livestock Center for Africa. They used to do good research. I was there as a third-year intern in 1989, and that's where I, for the first time, touched a computer. Okay? I can tell you they used to do very good data collection. I mentioned that a couple of weeks ago here, and I used their data from a place called Borona in Wollo for my senior research. And he's going to talk about Ethiopia and agriculture, and then I will come in and I will talk as much as time allows.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, I was at ILCA in Ethiopia from the late 70s to the late 80s. To have a look at Ethiopia, it's quite interesting because you have the Rift Valley running up through Ethiopia, and that's critical when you look at climatic conditions in the country, because the intertropical convergence zone moves more south and you have rainfall distributions. When I was there, there wasn't a country called Eritrea. This was what Ethiopia looked like. And I'm going to touch on some work that a colleague and I, Barry Henriksen and I, did at looking at length of growing period through a water balance model, and in particular at Debre and at Mekelle. Mekelle is the capital of Tigray, where the present government went in and attacked recently. TPLF, the Tigrayan people came and recaptured, and you may have seen that in the press. Asmara is the capital of Eritrea. The Belg season is their short rains, happens in April to May, and the main season, the Maya, happens in July to September. All right. So if you look at something like Mekelle, which is the capital of Tigray, and you look over a long time period at the length of the growing periods, and I'm showing this slide because I was in Ethiopia in 1984-5, which people of my age will remember from Live Aid and other things that happened at that time. And what we found was that Mekelle in Tigray usually had a growing period less than 90 days. And that was critical if you want to get some sort of crop production. In the 60s, you will see they were a disaster. And at that time, there was the first coup d'etat against Haile Selassie, but it didn't come to fruition. In the 72-73 period, there was another disastrous thing, and Haile Selassie, who was the king then, was replaced in a military coup. In 84, 85, you can see things start to go really bad. And we did this paper in January of 85, and we didn't have the 84 data, but we subsequently found that 84 was an absolute disaster. So what you have in the arid climatic conditions is a 3-year build-up where the smallholder is unable to get crop and production, and this causes the famine in the long term. I suppose we don't really need to look at this slide, but length of growing period has an effect on the yields, and this was summary of 42 participating ILCA farmers around Deborah Baham. Now, Deborah Baham's not a good area to talk about because they always have growing periods of 130 odd days and more. But you can see that, for example, when it's too wet, the wheat and the barley turn over, the moisture is not sufficient. So what happened in 84, 85? Well, 84, 85, it was the 10th anniversary of the revolution, 74. And so the government had a big celebration to say how wonderful they were. They basically ignored the North. They were fighting the North, but they ignored the people. Okay? However, a guy called Michael Burke went to Coram in the North and produced for the BBC pictures. People may remember seeing those pictures, which were absolutely disastrous. And the international governments responded with, listen to what's going on, here comes the grain. And we had the Live Aid of Bob Geldof and the raising of millions of money to be poured into Ethiopia. So the government tried to take advantage of it. If the food arrived, and the RAAF who were in here like there was no tomorrow, and they actually resided at Ilka, and I was lucky or unlucky enough to fly in a Hercules when it did the grain drop, and to see that grain go out the back and the people going and get it showed you how dramatic the situation was in the country. People outside Ethiopia don't realise that within Ethiopia at that time, the Ethiopians in Addis Ababa were sending money or whatever supplies they could to the country, to their people in the north. And that there were Tigrayans in government in the Durk. So that was the situation now, 2021. Climate conditions are pretty good. I haven't seen any documentation saying that there have been short of rains or whatever over in the country. The only thing that I have seen and read is that there's too much water. And if you look at Al Jazeera and you look at the Ethiopian water, you can see that there's too much rain. It should have ceased by now so that the crops can mature and be harvested. There should have been a national-wide election under the Constitution, and it wasn't held. Only Tigray held that, and the TPLF, Tigray People's Liberation Front, won all the seats. Government wasn't happy. They expunged all the Tigrayans from government posts, and they started arresting people in Addis Ababa of Tigrayan origin. Ethnic cleansing started to happen, followed by mass atrocities. The Eritrean forces went in and they savaged the country, looted it, pillaged it, reports of rape. I can tell you the story of an 89-year-old lady whose home was invaded and everything was taken out, all her clothes, everything, and she was left with only the clothes she was in. Okay? She subsequently died because she couldn't get health tablets from hospitals that had been raided and destroyed. So the Eritrean forces, as I said, have been ransacking the country, and this has caused a great deal of problem. Now, the other thing that they did was to burn the crops and destroy or steal livestock. So even if the country stock was peaceful now, and the moisture came back, there's no oxygen, and the farmers themselves are under pressure because they haven't had food supply. So that's the situation. I don't know if I've got any more slides. How do the Tigray people respond? Well, they fled when they heard what was going on. They fled into Sudan and they joined People's Liberation Front and formed the Tigray Defence Force and started fighting against the government. Exactly what happened in the 80s. Okay, they retook Bekele. There was further civil unrest across the country as other ethnic groups come under pressure, like the Oromo, the Afar, and others. They are joining in the fighting. And there's internally displaced people in the country. So the question I had at the end of it all that, looking at it, is, does Ethiopia as a country exist anymore? What's going to happen? I don't know. So can it recover? There's a large, do you want to come in here?
Oh, you can finish off, yeah.
There's a large extent debt. The official birth rate has gone from 2.07, which was fixed under the Durkin regime, to 46. It's entangled with Eritrea. And there's a border dispute between Eritrea and Ethiopia, so whether there will ever be peace, one doesn't know. And there's land disputes between ethnic groups, Amharas, Tigrayans, Oromo, who owns the land as the population has increased. When I was there in the 80s, there was 30 million. Today, there's over 100 million people. So land is a crucial issue. Donors are disappointed. They thought they'd overcome the Ethiopian issue and whatever, but now they're fed up. The other thing that's quite interesting, I was saying, someone was Michael, that in fact, in 84-5, the Russians were there and the West went in. Now you've got the West in and they're looking to America, but that's my ally in the government. So how do I support them? So there's political issues at that extent. And of course, they've destroyed the infrastructure and the economic capacity in the north. Oh, I did this slide because I'm interested in agriculture. And again, it goes to what I said before, lack of oxygen, no seeds, starvation. They've been there before. Let's hope they get out of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. So Jeff has given you a very good explanation of what's happening. Of course, given that this has been going on for 11 months, there is so many things that have been said. What Jeff hasn't mentioned is that there have been so many reports by Amnesty International, human rights groups, the international media, and so on. And you probably didn't notice, but when the US President Joe Biden spoke at the United Nations, two conflicts that he mentioned, problems that he mentioned. One was one in China, one was in northern Ethiopia. He has actually an executive order ready to do sanctions, more sanctions. They have done some things. There is a lot that has been said in the media and so on, but here in Australia, you don't hear it. Also, sometimes I have appeared for the first time on ABC I was choking to explain what was happening in January. That was 6 days into the war, and now it's more than 300 days. What happened? Well, my notice that I took out the bio from the flyer. Normally we have bios. The reason is I spent actually more than an hour writing a bio 2 days ago, and then the bio ends up being a story about the war. Okay? So she said she was interested, so I should say a few things. There was a revolution in Ethiopia, September 74. Jeff mentioned there was an attempt at a coup d'etat about 13, 14 years earlier. It failed. But this was the 70s. Everyone wanted to be a socialist. Everyone was reading Marx. That was the background. They didn't like what was happening in Ethiopia. What was happening in Ethiopia was in Ethiopia, 1/3 of the land was owned by the church. And then there were landlords. The students wanted these things to change. So there was a slogan, and the slogan was land to the tiller. What happened? We know what happens. Students can shake a government, but they cannot take power. That's what we saw with the Arab Spring. Taking power needs something else. It's not just protests. So what happened is the army gathered and said, the emperor is old, 82 years old. He has been in power for 44 years. And the army gathered and said the army needs to save the country. So 1974, there was a revolution. There were other interesting things that happened. School registration fees were abolished. And this is a good example of how poor Ethiopia was. There was a 1 birr registration fee. 1 birr meant about 20 pencils, okay? When it was abolished, all of a sudden there were so many children at school. The good thing was the teacher didn't know who was in the class because there were 87 in there. So I became student number 84 in a class of 87. Of course, everyone was asked to tear out the emperor's pictures from everything. And of course, kids are kids. I didn't like it, but kids were just going crazy. Okay? That's what happened. But everything came to a stop. 3 years later, the last bus had come and gone. So 8 years later, after that, I left. So the city was always under siege. That's omitting out a lot of detail. So I go to Alumaya. I left the war. 1 year when I began working, of course, the war came. The war had left Tigray and had come down to Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa was liberated in May 91. But what happened is, 2 days later, Ethiopia had these divisions like in the north, west, central, and so on. East, it was an important division because Ethiopia used to fight with Somalia. Harar, the eastern city, had the attraction of being an army town. The soldiers in the east, of course, knew that the war was over. But for some reason, some of them killed their leaders and said, we are going to fight. Because what had happened is a mob had started. Now people see what's happening, but the elements of people wanting to do what they are doing now was already there. And it took 2 days because they were killing Eritreans, Tigrayans, business people in the city and so on. 2 days later it came and I had basically seen the last tank in a ditch when I was going to Alumaya because that was where the war ended. So the war had come all the way down. And so that's why when I write the bio, it just becomes everything about the war. And 9 years later, when I finished my PhD, went for the first time after 12 years into Tigray. 4 days later, the Eritrean army had bombed a school there and I couldn't fly back. I had to go on land because air flights were cancelled. The war took 2 years. It changed Eritrea forever. It also killed a lot of Ethiopians. And it's also linked to what's happening now because there was a bitter dictator waiting for an opportunity to get back at Ethiopia. And he waited for 20 years and this came for him. He's not the first person to ruin a country. But 3 years ago, when people were suggesting him out of nowhere, I just couldn't believe that they were talking about him being a leader. He's plagiarizing Kissinger, everyone. And if you listen to what he says, I shouldn't play it. But it's just ridiculous. And it's a false interview. It's not even a real interview. What he was doing is he was building an image. What had happened is there were student protests, especially among the Oromos. And then it was clear that the party would give in and look for a new leader. And this guy was scheming behind. But even for people who occasionally pay attention to what's happening in Ethiopia, he was an unknown. But behind, he was scheming. And somehow, because he was a member of the federal parliament, the leader of the regional party allows him to become the leader of the party so that he could become a prime minister. Well, that leader, you don't hear about him anymore. But what happened is this person came forward. There was another thing interesting about him, which troubled me at the time. Trump is part of the story. Why? What he wanted is, he didn't care about what was happening around Ethiopia. He wanted a deal for the Egyptian around the Nile. In return for the Egyptians supporting his Palestine. And the US ambassador to Ethiopia, I was surprised to hear him mention this guy's name as a possible candidate. He did that. Michael Pompeo, there is a picture of him smiling as if he's getting married in Addis Ababa. And I am not sure what the issue is, but they were up to something. These guys were behind these guys. What happened? And there was an ambassador to Somalia from the US called Yamamoto. He was also up to something because he was going to Ethiopia, he was going to Eritrea. In fact, some of the Tigrayan leaders think he was a sailor. So how did this become a leader? Well, first, as part of the government, he was in the spy agency, so he was sending out secrets to Eritrea, so he was just interested in himself. They had been doing that for a long time. This is not a suspicion, they admit. He was selling secrets to opposition groups and so on. So somehow he had gotten the backing of outsiders and insiders, and of course, they almost thought he was one of them, so he came to power. He came to power. Everyone thought there was going to be reform in Ethiopia. Where are the Oromo supporters of him now? Well, most of the political leaders of the Oromos are in prison. Guys who brought him to power, and if the young come out to protest, they will be in prison, just like they did this week. He's not only arguing with the people in the north, but also with his own supposed base. The sad thing is he got the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2019. That's how sad things are. So the Nobel Prize couldn't be given to the Eritrean leader and him because the reason was, well, he created peace with Eritrea. It wasn't a peace pact, it was a war pact. The war was going to be against what's called the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, which had with its own allies in Ethiopia called the APRDF, the Common Front, displaced the military government in 91, leading Ethiopia until 2018. People didn't realize this was a war pact, so he became the main instrument for the Eritrean despot who had been waiting for an Abiy, basically, in Ethiopia. So when Abiy came to power, there were 17 opposition groups that returned from Eritrea, 17. So it was a hatching ground for Ethiopian opposition. That's what happened. So it's not the first time that a less known person comes and just turns the country upside down. And in Ethiopia, in the last 50 years, we have had two people cause so much damage. And what happens is American presidents, if you take them as a parameter, wouldn't touch them with a stick. So here is a person who was leading Ethiopia between 91 and 2012, but unfortunately he died suddenly. So what had happened over the last 30 years is war had ended, but Eritrea was still unhappy. The leadership, Ethiopia was progressing. Now, if you look at Addis Ababa in 91 and now, it's different cities. Okay. But many people don't want to admit that. If I look at Ethiopians now, what I see is people who are taller, heavier, healthier. Okay, that's not the whole Ethiopia. We were talking with Jeff last week. If you look at the pictures from the famine in 84 and now, even the clothing is people now wear different things, colorful things, not just khaki. So Ethiopia had changed a lot, but it's a poor country. So what happened is economic progress wasn't going together with political progress or liberty. And of course, there was always political groups that wanted something different, found a home in Eritrea, they just waited. And what happens is, same thing as Haile Selassie, doesn't have a succession plan, didn't have the good people around him to replace him, things don't work out. Instead, what he did is he just passed it on to someone called Haile Mariam. Haile Mariam was the one who negotiated with Abiy and passed on the power, and that's what happened. So we have a repeat of 1984 this week. After arresting all the opposition groups, the Oromos, after leaving out a big chunk of Ethiopian population from the election, he had this so-called election and it was being celebrated. You would think this is in a highly developed country. It's in Ethiopia. In the capital, life is different from everywhere else. And this is economists saying Ethiopia is losing friends and influence. How many African leaders came? Well, you can count them here. Kenya, I don't think he's enthusiastic to come, but his next neighbor, so it would be noticeable if he didn't. Same with Djibouti, same with South Sudan, somebody from Nigeria. This is in Addis Ababa. What happens from the capital is different. So you see, this is UNICEF, this is the UN Secretary General talking about catastrophe that's about half children being starved and so on. And at the war front, you get the same thing. Ethiopia, like in the 70s and 80s, is sending waves and waves of armies that never come back. They will never come back. In 1978, from that shock, I have seen a lot of things. The Second Army, Ethiopia's largest army, Second Army, came into my hometown over 2 full days. They went to Western Tigray. The slogan was, we shake up Tigray, because there was a small liberation front, and we destroy Eritrea. They went west, didn't come. There were more waves, they went in, never came back. That's what's happening. This is after 8 months of war in Tigray, they retreat. And this is the Ethiopian POWs. It's a lot of women. They finish high school. There is no job opportunities. The army becomes clothing and shelter. They go in, and that's it. And they never stop and look for other solutions until it's too late. It happened in the 80s. It's happening now. And that's what's happening. So in Ethiopia, you have the war expanding now. This is in April on the left. The Eritreans were inside Tigray. Amhara were inside Tigray. Amharas are claiming land. There are a lot of issues. And they were keen to take Western Tigray. They were in. By June, they had gone out. By July, the Tigrayan forces, because they cannot take Western Tigray and because they are blockaded, and have another goal. Well, the Tigrayan forces said that's not going to happen. They are going to come. And they came out. So the war has spread into the Amhara region. The green here is where the Tigrayan forces are. And now there are more displaced people in other regions. And still no one wants to negotiate. And of course, there is a priest. Ethiopian priests, there are two types of priests in Ethiopia. There are the genuine priests, the ones who fast, the ones who don't need anything. These are the true priests. But Ethiopia has also a tradition of having priests that are happy to go with anything. And this week, this man is praising the president, the prime minister, for coming up with this philosophy of addition, where everything is added in Ethiopia except some parts of Ethiopia are not completely out of it, like Tigray. They have no representation in the government, are not part of the government's budget. There are no schools, no hospitals, no health care. In fact, they are not allowing others help dying people, and that is okay in Ethiopia now. And that's how sad it is. Just I will finish off with a couple of slides. How Ethiopia become peaceful? Well, if you look at the last 250 years, Ethiopia has never had a peaceful handover of power. Power is always contested. In a way, Ethiopia is a country that has not been formed yet. The new Ethiopia, I am not talking about the old one. The person who would claim to be the last emperor of the old Ethiopia, Yohannes IV, he died in 1989. Ethiopians, I am not sure if they have common heroes. Now, when Ethiopians mention about their emperors, they like Menelik's name. Menelik is the one who basically gave up Eritrea to the Italians in return for guns, and then went on and dominated almost and expanded Ethiopia southward. That's the modern Ethiopia. That's the tragedy of Ethiopia. 1961, Haile Selassie did a mistake. Eritrea came back from colonization first to the British and then to Ethiopia, and then he said he wanted to demolish the federation, giving them more reason to fight, and of course, that's what happened. 74, we have discussed. 91, we have covered it. 98, there was a sad war. So the chapters never get closed. History and culture is everything in a poor country. Unfortunately, history is used as an excuse for wars. There are too many ethnic groups. There is a Nile River. Egypt wants water. Sudan wants water. Ethiopia wants water. The Red Sea. Now there are new regional powers. Ethiopia has had proud people, but has had leaders who sell it out. And we have seen that with Menelik selling out Yohannes, not going to war. Yohannes fighting. Menelik just post-sharing. Current war is divisive. This picture of a school children from Human Rights Watch. They destroyed everything, as Jeff said, schools, everything. They have done everything. You don't need news. I used to speak to my mother until they again cut off the communication in June. You know, I could hear her voice vibrate. Just innocent people doing nothing, just being killed. This is happening, but the sad thing is Ethiopians are highly divided. The best they would do is pretend not to know. And the bad ones, of course, say, this is fine. The international community really needs a new approach. It needs to do things better. It needs to be consistent. Stop just urging, expressing concern forever. Yemen, how many years? 8 years. Syria, now Ethiopia.